Alright, what's up everybody? This is Ryan and you're watching episode 43 of my live stream Q&A. So just a random little tidbit that is actually true about me is that 43 happens to be my favorite number. I'm not actually joking about that. I won't explain why, but maybe eventually. Anyways, so yeah, a couple things to jump into right off the bat, but before we get to that, I would just like to thank the following people for supporting me on Patreon and PayPal. So that's going to be Hank Martin Leidelmeyer. That's a very German name if I've ever heard one. Seth Keegan, Trevor Halvorsen, Tina Fredericks, Nanotech, A.A. Mon, Mr. Bidwell, Graham Hertzeg, Sushil Chanda, Elad Stavi, Shoku Mostofi, Tomas, Kwan Kaye, and Mario Huizinga. So to those people I say thank you very much. Always very appreciated, and I will be using the money which has been kindly given to me through the Patreon and PayPal accounts soon to be picking up some new equipment. So I plan on picking up a better quality microphone. At the moment I can just have this cheap one here, which the sound quality is decent, but I'm gonna end up picking up a proper shotgun mic or something like that, but we'll see. Anyways, so yeah, really lots of appreciation there for everyone supporting me. And if you enjoy the show and would like to support it, but you don't really have the financial means to do so, or for whatever reason, you could do me a favor, and any video that you watch of mine that you like, do me a favor and hit the like button down below. Of course, I'm on social media, so Facebook, Twitter, Google+, if anyone actually uses that. I know a couple people do. And yeah, so that's basically my commercial for today. So, of course, one of the big announcements I have right off the bat. Oh, too quiet. Testing. Huh. One sec. Okay, that should be much better. Alright, apologies to everyone. So, I don't know why, but every now and again, for some reason, when I go into my recording settings, my microphone's audio level has just been drastically reduced. Now, I don't consciously remember going into my sound settings and reducing the quality or the audio of my microphone, because I have no reason to do that, but Windows 10. So, sorry about that. Anyways, that's much better. So, anyways, back on track here. So what I was talking about, so of course, as some of you have noticed, the live stream has started at a new time. So we are now at 9:30 a.m. roughly Pacific time. So I do have to apologize. I realize this will displace some of my viewers in India and Asia, further east of India and Southeast Asia and so forth. So I do apologize about that. The reason why I had to change the time of the live stream is it just became very apparent that working quite late on Saturday nights is going to be a regular thing at my new job. And I see we still have complaints about the audio, but I see that it's very loud in my decibel counter, so I think you're going to have to just turn up the sound on your end, Robert, but hopefully that's loud enough. Yeah. Anyways. So yeah, my new job is basically kicking the shit out of me, and for that reason, like for example, I got out of work at about 2:30 last night, and so what I was doing before is, so that's 2:30 a.m., and I get home by 3:15, go to bed by 3:30, 3:45 a.m., and the previous 2 Sundays I did that, essentially, and then woke up at 6 a.m., to start the stream at 8 a.m. So I was doing the streams off of about 2.5 hours of sleep, and that was just not working very well. I was kind of ruining my sleep schedule for the whole week. So anyways, hopefully this will be a lot better. Anyways, so yeah, that's basically why we're doing the stream a little bit later. And yeah, eventually when I'm not really tied up to a particular company, what I plan to do is have a stream for 2 streams a week. One of them will be sort of to cover my viewers in India and Asia, which is basically the majority. And then also I'll do another 2 weekly streams. The second one will be at a time which is more appropriate, hopefully, for my North American and European viewers. And yeah, so I think that's basically it. And my computer is churning like crazy. Not sure why. That's very bizarre. Anyways, so I'll just have to open up a quick panel here and we'll get started with the questions. Okay, so we have a question right off the bat. Okay, so Shashank asks how to choose an architecture for an application. So that's a good question. So what I'll do, I'll give you kind of just a brief overview of the what I would call industry standard architectures on the Android platform anyways. And then what I'll do is I'll talk about where you might want to go from there. So generally speaking, there are 2 main architectures which are followed on the Android platform. Now there is a third one. The 2 main are either MVP, which I generally recommend as just a good general purpose architecture, and then you have MVVM. So those are kind of the 2 main choices. Now, one of the things about this is that in certain ways this is really just a front-end architecture. So if you'd like, I can go into let me know in the comments if you'd like. I can go sort of deeper into the, say, back-end layer or the middle layer if you're thinking of like a clean architecture. But just as a general purpose, you're probably going to want to start with either MVP or MVVM. There is, of course, MVC, and honestly, as time progresses on the Android platform, the difference between MVP and MVC is hard to tell. Really, the only regular difference I've seen is that the controller in MVC gets quite large, whereas the presenter in MVP tends to be, at least the way I do it, it tends to be centered in a particular feature of the app. So how do you choose an architecture for an app? So really what I would say here is, so it's difficult. There's no sort of silver bullet architecture. If you have an app with a fairly simple user interface, so just nothing that complicated, say like a calculator app or something like that, and this is generally the architecture I'll use. If you have an app which has a fairly simple user interface, I would strongly recommend MVP. Why? And I'll kind of I'll attach a footnote here. Passive screen. which is sort of a subset of MVP. So why would I recommend that? With a simple UI and passive view, which is, I'll say, subset of MVP, you don't really need to test your view. Instead, you can get away with just testing the presenter. So this is my general purpose architecture that I recommend is model view presenter. Now there's a couple reasons for that, which I won't spend a huge amount of time going into. I can talk about it later. It's something I ramble about quite a bit on this show. But I generally recommend model view presenter. If you have I would say intricate UI which exposes lots of backend data, or you would, how can I say this? That would probably be the best way of describing it. Really what I'm trying to do here, if you have an intricate UI which exposes lots of backend data, you may have better luck with MVVM. Otherwise, in MVP, your presenter can get quite large. So here's the thing about this question, though. So you're asking how to choose an architecture for an app, and there's kind of two main parts to that. To sort of let's get back to this exact question here. So the main point I'd like to make here, it does depend a little bit on the problem domain at hand. So I would generally recommend MVP at this point. As it works great as general separation of concerns. Because the thing I feel about this question is I don't know what your skill level is. So if you have never heard of MVP or MVVM, or you're totally new to them, for me to like really dive into the fine details of what actually separates them, like for example the fact that in MVVM the view model can't talk directly to the view, things of that nature, that might not actually be very useful to you if you're a beginner. So what I'm going to say to you honestly is, if you're not sure what architecture to use and you're new to it, I would suggest Model View Presenter. I have lots of tutorials on this. I have a article as well on passive view and SOC. My article on MVVM/MVP/MVC is called "What WTF Does MVP Actually Mean?" So I have an article on my blog. You can check that out if you like. That's going to be at wiseassblog.com. So for just about everyone, I recommend MVP. And I recommend it because I believe it to be the least confusing architecture. Now, there's certain cases where if you're using Model View Presenter, you might be creating some extra difficulty for yourself. Like Model View View Model is great because you can have many-to-one ratios of views and view models, and there's certain things you can do which will sort of help you build a complicated UI. And kind of the last thing I'll say about this question is that, to be perfectly honest, in my own in my architectures, the way I currently build them, I actually make use of a view model within Model View Presenter architecture. So I'm really not trying to confuse you or overload you with too much information. The subject of three-layer architectures is difficult because on one hand, there's so much literature on just MVP and just MVVM, speaking of them as very separate sort of things, and when you really get down into the actual difference between the two, it might be, I found it surprisingly underwhelming. But anyways, yeah. Hopefully that kind of answers your question. I went all over the place there, but it's kind of a general question, which is fine. Nothing wrong with that. Hmm. 2D Recyclerview. Let me think about that one, Bassam. I'm not sure. So horizontal with I think I would have to see like a, so Bassam is asking about making a specialized recycler view. So it's horizontal. I don't think I can help you with that, Bassam. I've never really done that myself, and I'm not 100% sure exactly what you mean. I kind of get what you're talking about, but I think I'd need to see a picture, because it 2D, so horizontal recycler view with vertical columns where the items can communicate between each other throughout the whole parent. I would need to like see a picture and know like what you're sort of, what exactly do you need to communicate between them. That could be kind of difficult because if you say you have the items communicating to each other, that could potentially add quite a bit of logic to your view. So just longer story shorter, I think what you're trying to do could be pretty difficult. If you have some code or images or something, maybe I can help you later on, but I don't really have an answer for you right now, unfortunately. Oh, that's an interesting one. Wow. Okay, this is an interesting question. I'm gonna get in this, and I see we have, I can't remember. I think Polish W is a V, but if I'm pronouncing it wrong, forgive me, Victor. But to Victor, I say dziękuję for your question. Okay, so I'm going to bring the thought hammer down here. This is pretty hilarious to me. Now, I understand where this is coming from. I'll just write this here, so this will be a good question. Okay, so what time are we at here? 9. Since we're on the topic of architecture. So my friend Victor says, I was talking with a C# developer, and he said it's easier to create an application without an architecture, and then if you have time to refactor it, but it depends on how much time we have. So let me just take a moment here to really, I'm just getting a flood of opinions in my brain about how wrong this is. So let me see where to start. Now, I think where this opinion comes from is So here's the thing. One of the things I've always tried to do is I treat my applications and my code work as if I'm a product owner, as opposed to someone who is just trying to build the application, get the client to sign the check, and then move on to the next project as fast as possible. So let me preface this by saying, all of what I'm about to say assumes a few things. You aren't just concerned about getting paid. And look, if that's your only concern, that's fine. I just don't work that way. And that's fine too. So all of what I'm about to say assumes a few things. You aren't just concerned about getting paid. Number one. I was going to say you have enough time. I'm not even going to entertain the idea that it's easier to create an application without an architecture. So right off the bat, this is just wrong, in my opinion. Just flat out wrong, that it's easier to create an application without an architecture. No disrespect to the C# developer, but that is a very... To me, that is a statement which comes from someone who does not really know anything about architecture and hasn't actually used them regularly. Because one of the things you'll find when you start to get good with architectures, and believe me, it takes time. It's not easy. What you'll see very quickly is the amount of time you save following an architecture. Anyways, I'll just preface that with that little statement there. So what I'm gonna say is, assuming your single goal isn't just getting paid and going on to a new client. So with that being said, let's start with this. So first thing that I take issue with. So it's easier to create an application without an architecture. So this statement is about analogous to saying it is easier to build a house without a blueprint or a foundation. And you can just kind of go back later. Maybe you just like lay some gravel down on a pad and you get some a couple of 2x4 pieces of wood and you just start hammering away there, and pretty soon you've maybe got like a garden shed, and then you realize, oh, I actually had to build a house. Oh, but the foundation of the house is just gravel, and apparently when you're building a house foundation it needs to be like a cement pad, blah blah blah. Probably a lot of people aren't understanding what the hell I'm talking about. I've worked a bit of construction in my life, I'll put it that way. So here's the thing. So building applications is a lot like building houses in a certain way, or buildings. The architecture is going to give you so many different things up front, but the most important thing is it's going to give you a general structure to work with. So the first thing is, I fundamentally reject the idea that it's easier to build without an architecture. I hope that's not a very controversial point for everyone. I'm trying to think of another analogy here. It's like saying, well, a lot of people actually do that, but it's like doing a startup business and just doing all of this upfront work, and then at the very end being like, oh, I forgot to like register with the IRS and set up payroll. I'm struggling to find a good analogy here. So anyways, just to wrap this point up here, this is not true. So when you start to build applications with an architecture, it's a lot quicker and easier. So for example, if I go actually into code for a change here, so this is just the package view. I realize it's a little bit small for some people, but this is the sort of package structure of Kotlin MVP calculator. It's a big-ass Kotlin MVP tutorial, which I'm working on. A couple episodes are up. You can find the link in the description box down below. So before I wrote any of these classes, I knew well ahead of time what architecture I was going to use. And instead of, for example, thinking of the architecture in code, I'm going to share with you a way to figure out your architecture ahead of time to give you a basic idea. So whenever I was learning these architectures, what I would do is I would just draw a diagram. So when I was learning model view view model, I drew this little diagram which explains the actual difference between model view view model and model view presenter. And then I based the features of my application on this same blueprint, this architecture. I did not just jump in and just start slapping big balls of mud together, a spaghetti code crap, and then think that I was going to go back later. So that's like, for example, the model view view model. What else have I got here? I should have, there's my big ass architecture diagram. And so for a more complicated, this is Marco Pierre White, a famous chef. He looks very tired in this photo. So this, sorry, that was a totally random tangent, but the image popped up, so I had to explain it. He's kind of a idol of mine. Anyways, so this is, for example, an architecture diagram of a more complicated architecture. So again, I took the time ahead of time before I built the application to draw this thing out. I drew it on paper first, of course. So yeah, I think that hopefully that drives the point home. So A, it's not easier to start without an architecture, and B, all you really need to do when you're learning how to start building your stuff to an architecture is you really just need to draw some boxes and sticks with words, and then whatever this thing does, so a presenter handles logic, don't deviate from that. And that's really, in a nutshell, what the architecture is going to give us. The value of the architecture is that it separates the concerns so that things are easier to change. That's a big reason why you don't start without an architecture. Easier to change with an architecture. It's like the difference between using a hammer, hammering a house together, and using a drill to screw a house together. With the screws, you can take them out and maybe rebuild something, whereas if you're hammering everything together, your structure is very hard to sort of take apart. Anyways, I'm tangenting all over the place here. Let's get back to the text, the notes here. So, yeah. So let me just try and summarize this point because I've gone all over the place. So, why do I think it's a bad idea to start without, let's go there. Why do I think it's a bad idea to code without an architecture? Architectures actually save you time in the design process because you already can just start building things right away, and you know that logic code goes in the presenter, you know that data code is going to go in the back end, and you're not building spaghetti code or big balls of mud, they're called. So architectures actually save you time in the design process, so that's the first thing. The refactoring time added from trying to rebuild spaghetti, hopefully I spelled that correctly, spaghetti code garbage will likely be drastically higher than the time you think you saved. So this is another important point. So one of the reasons why architectures are great is that they're easy to change. There's all these different things like look into solid principles and separation of concerns, because these are complicated topics, but when you actually understand what's going on with solid principles and separation of concerns, then you actually will sort of understand what are the benefits of using an architecture. Because until you've used an architecture yourself and you understand it yourself, you're kind of just going on other people's opinions about whether something's useful or not. What else? Why do I think it's a bad idea to code without an architecture? Yeah, that's basically it. So this is just, there is this idea that using an architecture creates extra time, and I have never seen that opinion voiced by someone who actually regularly uses architectures, is what I would suggest. So I think I'll probably move on from there. Now, the last point, I'll just make one final point here. If you're in a position where you don't know any architectures, but you still need to code, by all means, build your app, build your spaghetti code app. So when I started as a developer, I had no clue about architecture. No one had told me about it, and I was building the ugliest. The first app I built almost wasn't even object oriented. It was because it was written in Java, but I wasn't even sending like objects between activities. I would just like send random strings all over the place, and I had like, yeah, it was just horrible. So for the first year, I basically built applications without an architecture. Now, there's value in doing that because at the end of the day, that's better than nothing, because you're still practicing the skill of writing code and designing apps. And in fact, it's almost better if you spend time building apps without architecture, so that when you start to use the architecture, you will see so quickly the benefits. It'll solve problems before they even become problems. There will be things that you're working on that are like really annoying in your spaghetti architecture that aren't even problems in the other architecture. Like for example, if you follow MVP passive view, you arguably don't need to test your view because of your architecture. That's time saved. So this is the main thing. So if you're in a position where you don't know any architectures, but you still need to code, by all means fly at it. And I'm not making fun or disparaging anyone who doesn't know architecture. I am disparaging this person who really, the C developer really doesn't know what they're talking about, in my opinion. But anyways, so final point, what I would suggest to you, Victor, you mentioned later on that you're trying to get started with architecture or something along those lines. What I would suggest, Victor, pick a very simple application. So maybe to get started with architecture, pick a simple application like a calculator or to-do list. Build it based on an open source code base that you prefer. So for example, and this is something I do all the time. So when I want to learn a new architecture, the first thing I'll do is I'll try and find a project that's open source so that I can copy and learn code from it. And then I'll have that open basically the whole time that I'm coding my new app so that I don't have to spend a whole bunch of time trying to figure out how to build it. I just go, okay, they do that over here. Okay, this is how I do it here, kind of thing. Once you build one or two applications doing that, then that'll give you like a framework to just get started with building every architecture, every application with a basic architecture. At the bare minimum, even if you don't use MVP or MVVM, just try to keep your database code separate from your UI code and try not to have giant God activities. Like, just make an effort to separate things out. And I'm going to give you a peek behind the curtain, so to speak, and it's an expression. What is the actual value of using an architecture properly, like really following an architecture? The actual value is separation of concerns. Now, I won't explain that in depth because that's something you really need to learn over lots of trial and error and just a deep understanding. But when you separate the concerns of your architecture, it becomes easier to build, easier to change, easier to test, and easier to refactor, I was going to say, but that's change as well. So good job, Ryan. But building apps becomes a lot easier. Easier to read, because instead of just random bits of code being in stupid classes with terrible names because they do 500 different things, your logic is in your logic class, your UI code is in your UI classes, your database code is in your database classes. It's that simple. So hopefully that answers your question, Victor, and very good question. I should also mention, Victor mentioned that was wondering if I always use architecture in my apps because it's easier or easy for me. I would say that my brain is very suited to architecture, but make no mistake that these are things that I've been studying for years. So I would say it took me for the first year of building apps, I didn't really have any architecture, and it took about a year after that before I really understood Model View Presenter, because a lot of articles really screw it up. There's just a lot of terrible resources on architecture, and I fully intend on fixing that to whatever capacity I can, because architecture is mandatory. It's mandatory when you're building a building. It's mandatory when you're building an app, depending on your opinions. Okay, I have a ton of questions, so let me... so I'm just going to run a quick commercial break, and then we'll get to another question here. Okay, a lot of good questions. Okay, so let me just do a couple rapid fire questions here. I'll see. I've got a couple that I can knock off pretty quickly. So number one. So SW asks observable versus flowable versus single. So these are, and that's basically just that's the whole question. So these are different kinds of observables. Actually, let me use the generic term. What is it? Oh, come on, brain, you can do this. So there's oh, my brain is just really not helping me here. Subject, not a subject. Oh, just give me a second. I'll go into my own friggin' notes if I can't remember it. This is a common problem for me, is that I know exactly what I'm trying to explain to you, but I've forgotten the word, because one of the problems with RxJava oh, actually, observer is sort of the generic term. Subject and subscriber. Subject and subscriber is what it is. Okay, there we go. Sorry, the jargon for RxJava is just absurdly annoying because there's so many different ways to say the same thing, and it really is detrimental. These are different kinds of subjects, I will call them. So essentially an observable. In terms of language games, essentially these three are all subsets of a subject, and a subject is just something that emits events. It's a data source. Now, many people consider observable to be the like the parent class, and it depends on whether you're looking at RxJava or the which specification you're looking at. So yeah, so these are different kinds of subjects. Really quickly, so observable is a non-back pressure enabled subject. Flowable is a back pressure enabled subject. And single. So what is it about single? It doesn't have... It's a one-shot. Single is rather like async task. Let me just pull up the actual documentation here and just to make sure I'm speaking exactly correctly. Okay, on next. On error, uncompleted. Okay, I get it. So it doesn't have on complete. That's the main thing, I believe. Yeah. Okay. So I just wanted to make sure I got this exactly correctly. So single is rather like async task. To follow up. So the main difference from it and the others is that it does not have the on complete callback. So essentially it has or wait, yeah, it doesn't have on complete. So it has on success item whatever and on error or whatever the actual thing is called. I don't really care. So it has these two callbacks. So this would be something you would want to use if you like, say, make a network call. Now, the thing about this, so I've given you a basic explanation of what these three things are. In RxJava 2 currently, you're basically going to want to use a flowable most of the time. If you're not sure, use flowable. It's in RxJava 2 specifically. Basically, it's like the de facto observable. What I would suggest, Kaushik Gopal. I really apologize if I screw that name up. Kaushik Gopal from Fragmented Podcast wrote some amazing articles on RxJava 2. I would highly suggest you read these because he explains very well why you should basically most of the time be using flowable instead of observable, which is an RxJava 2 thing specifically. And he goes in to explain what a subject is and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to leave that question there. That ended up going longer than I thought it would, but that's okay. So just case in point, observable, no back pressure. Flowable, you probably want to be using this even if you don't really need back pressure. Single is basically the same as observable, except it does not have onComplete. You can't terminate it. So you would use single when you just want a single value returned and you don't necessarily want to like terminate the stream entirely or whatever. You don't need to call onComplete, which is fairly common actually. There's a couple other, but hopefully that kind of answers your question. Okay, and this was the next one I wanted to get to. So this is not disrespect. I'm just honestly curious. May I ask where you're from? And I will try and pronounce your name. So, Aisawi. I'm very curious to know where that name is from. I'm just curious about names and pronouncing them properly, but hopefully I pronounce it. So Aisawi asks, learning and creating an app, how to combine with them. So I believe what you're asking, how do I learn at the same time as creating a real app? So you've asked a very, very important question, sir, or I believe, sir. Statistically speaking, most likely, sir. You've asked a very important question, and the answer I can give is that you actually want to learn by building real applications, not necessarily applications you'll publish. That would be great, but the one thing I did very, very accidentally correctly is that instead of approaching, let me write this down. Instead of approaching app development, instead of approaching the learning of app development by studying random topics and trying to memorize everything, I strongly suggest you follow what I call come on, there we go, project-based learning approach. So what is a project-based learning approach? About what it sounds like. So if you're a beginner, pick a simple app you would like to build and build it. Don't expect it to be perfect. Expect that you're going to have to rebuild it many times, but that is actually a far better way to learn code than to say just try and study the 1,000 subjects you'll end up getting into in programming. Building an app is essentially the best way to learn how to build apps. And this goes into, so in episode 40, I talked about learning how to learn. Episode 40 of the Q&A, I'm going to suggest you go and watch that, because in that episode, I explain a lot about cognition, just learning how to learn, or cognition is the word. So cognition is basically a topic of how the brain learns things, and it's a topic which I'm very interested in and have taken a couple courses on. And one of the most fundamental concepts you learn from learning cognition or studying cognition is that the brain retains more information when it does lots of things with the information. So if I just like read something, like let's say I read this stupid thing here, if I were to read it, this is a terrible example, but so if I just read something, my retention rate, my learning rate is very low. If I read it and then I write it down and then I explain it, my retention rate, my learning rate is going to be very good. The same thing applies with building applications. If I just write down what I learn about building apps, that's going to be very ineffective compared to building the actual application. So don't worry about doing it perfectly at first. Just worry that build your app and learn things related to the app you're building. And that will make those topics relevant, which is also very important for cognition. Go watch episode 40. I talk about this a lot. This is the best, building an app is the best way to learn building apps. Okay, what else have we got? I see I had a follow-up question that was very similar by Rob Taylor asking basically the same thing. What I would suggest, please do go watch that video. I think there's timestamps, but if not, whatever. But I talk about the best ways to learn quite frequently. So when you're a beginner, you're probably going to be spending most of your time on Stack Overflow. You're going to want to try and get away from Stack Overflow. For the beginners listening, check out open source repositories like GitHub. Learn what that means. Learn what GitHub means. You need to know this if you're a developer. You can see Android architecture blueprints, Android architecture components, and bracket code, which is me. And just a final point here. So a lot of people will complain about my videos, not necessarily the live stream, but my tutorials, because they'll complain that they're too long and I teach too many subjects at one time. While I understand that criticism to a degree, one of the reasons why when I teach app building, I build the whole app on camera is because building an application and learning about it is not an isolated subject by subject process. So that's why I like to capture the whole process of building the application, because I believe that is the best learning experience for a student. But anyways, I know there's a lot of differing opinions on that. What else have we got here? Okay, so I've got kind of a deep question here. Just give me a moment. So every now and again I get asked a question which really cuts to the core of the human experience and is somewhat of a deviation from programming, but I think it might be worth it to just spend a moment here to touch on this, because this is a very fundamental question about reality, and this is the kind of thing that I've always been interested in. So, Ollie asks, are geese real? No. Anyways, moving on. Great question, Ollie. You made my day. All right, what else have we got? I think I'm just going to do one more question here. I have so many questions. Let's end with this one. This is always a popular topic. Stefan. Oh yeah, I'm like buzzing with friggin' coffee energy here. All right. So this will be probably the question I'll end on. Maybe I'll do a little bit of rambling at the end. So is Kotlin better than Java on Android development? When to use Kotlin and when to use Java? So for beginners, so novices to Java and Kotlin, I would suggest learning the basics of Java first, then transition to Kotlin. If you're interested in it. So this is the first thing. I do suggest to most people start with the basics of Java. Those are going to carry over very well to Kotlin. And there's also some basic stuff about Java that you're probably going to want to know, because one of the most important things about Kotlin is that it compiles to Java. So you're going to want to understand what the JVM is, and pretty much everything you learn in Java will translate to Kotlin. For those who are competent, hopefully I spelled that right, competent in Java, if you have any interest, learn Kotlin. Interest is key, again, to go back to cognition, because I'm bouncing all over the place. If you're not interested in learning Kotlin, you'll have a hard time learning it. So maybe that interest comes from the fact that employers will like it if you know Kotlin. Whatever, that's one little example. So to get back to the question, is Kotlin better than Java on Android development? So it's hard to... I can't really expressly say that Kotlin is better. Let me explain some of the things okay, let me say, as a Java pro, I think I can call myself that at this point. I think I know Java really well. What don't I know? There's definitely stuff, but I'm pretty comfortable. Well, I won't be that arrogant. As a Java whatever. As a Java journeyman working in Kotlin, That's a sentence. Okay, let me just say, as a Java developer, here's what I've found working in Kotlin. And by the way, for the beginners listening, if you like my teaching style and you like it when someone helps you build pretty much the entire application on camera and explains all the fine little details, then you'll like my new Kotlin tutorial on my channel. Go check it out. I teach you how to build a basic model view presenter, clean architecture Kotlin application and give you the basics of Kotlin. You're going to want to know the basics of Java, and I'm not saying it's going to be an easy tutorial, but if you're looking for an introduction into software architecture and Kotlin, go check that out. So as a I can't even talk. As a Java developer, here's what I found working in Kotlin. You can write your apps faster. So really quickly, what's a quick example? So when I jump into Kotlin right off the bat, so in Kotlin we have these things called data classes. So instead of having to write a giant ass model with getters and setters and a constructor and toString methods and all that, when I want to build a data class like a Pojo or a Poco, we'll call it here. Like for example, let's go into my Java code. Let me pull up a model of some kind. What is this tutorial about? Repository? Yeah. So to write this kind of thing, like a data model, I call it, this is what you have to do in Java, all this crap. When you go to Kotlin, you just slap this data keyword on here, which gives you all the getters and setters for all of the variables, which you just write in the class declaration thing, whatever it's called right here. There's so many different things that Kotlin will give you, and that's just one single micro example, but you can write apps faster. What else? So that's an important point. My brain, I'm getting pretty tired here, but suffice it to say, once you're comfortable with Kotlin, it very much feels like a better version of Java. It just feels like a modern version of Java. You have to get used to the syntax. The syntax is a little weird. All that changes is that the type is swapped with the name. In Java, of course, we have string value. In Kotlin, we have value, which is the name of the variable, and then string. So yeah, once you get used to writing that, then you'll start to see how Kotlin is pretty damn awesome. Why didn't I say it's better yet? Sorry, why didn't I say up here, is Kotlin better than Java on Android development? So very specifically here, because Kotlin is still new, there's a couple reasons why you might run into issues using it on Android. And this is just a feature of the fact that it's a fairly new language. Not super new, but relative to Java, quite new. You've got hiccups. Like for example, I had a lot of trouble running and compiling my unit tests in Kotlin. So there are drawbacks to using Kotlin in our awkward transition phase that might pop up. Now the thing about this is that Kotlin has a very active development team, and it's got a lot of support from Android, so you can pretty much expect that people are going to be working on improving it constantly. What was the last point I was going to make before my brain just entirely shuts down? Further to that, There's a lot of people who are working on bringing Kotlin to multiple different platforms so that you could essentially write your backend, your cloud database in Kotlin, and then your, say, iOS app in Kotlin native, and your Android app in Kotlin, and your browser app in Kotlin native. And people are really working towards Kotlin being multi-platform. And I think that is actually where the industry will move to. Just to end on kind of a philosophical point here, well, not really. The thing about what I do as an Android developer, or what people do as an iOS developer, as internet gets better, I think it's going to make less and less sense to write an app in Swift for iOS and then write an app in Kotlin or Java on Android, and then write an app in JavaScript or whatever, Python, for a browser app. To me, it's going to make more sense, and we already see this happening with things like React, that you're going to want a solution which works through the browser on any kind of device. So, a lot of people are pushing towards React Native, or Google has released Flutter, and there's different solutions which are popping up. But basically, to sort of summarize the question, is Kotlin better than Java on Android development? Once you get the hang of it, yes, but you still have to deal with certain costs of writing in Kotlin. Now, the cool two final points. So, as a con, Kotlin compiles to Java, then that compiles to Java bytecode. So when you're building your project in Kotlin, there's like a two-step compilation. So Kotlin will increase your compile time a lot, potentially. So if you have a slow machine, you probably will have difficulty with Kotlin. And then for a pro, I think I might have just forgot it. What was it? I know I had something. No, it's gone. I'm sorry. Well, I think that'll be it for today. I'll just hop into the chat for a couple final comments here, but okay, one last quick question here. Oops. This question, why do developers recommend MVP? Because MVC is outdated and MVVM is bizarre, confusing, and not really a clearly defined architecture relative to how most people use it. So I almost always recommend Model View Presenter, and the main reason, honestly, is that it's the least confusing. Model View View Model is very confusing for several reasons, including the fact that MVVM was not originally called as such. It was called Presentation Model, or I think Application Model was another name. So it was not originally called Model View View Model. View Model is potentially a very misleading name. Many people who use MVVM end up with a view model which acts as a, what will I call it, which handles data management and application logic, which is a breakage of separation of concerns. So many people, so we have this object which is called a view model. You've given me an opportunity to complain about MVVM, so thank you, Bhushan. I love it whenever I get to do this. So the name view model, so view model, to me, what does that imply? A class which stores data necessary to render the UI. So this is what you would think reading the name view model, and often we get this thing which handles logic, application logic, and talks to a backend, and essentially model view model necessitates some kind of decision maker class like a presenter or view controller or something like that. And then all of a sudden we're already out of our three layers here, because we essentially have two model classes and then a UI class, and we have no decision maker. Or we have something that is both a model class and a decision maker, which I don't like to do that. I don't like to have a class which has its hand in multiple different things of the three primary layers. Whatever you call the stupid architecture, the goal is to separate three things: UI code, logic, data. Whatever we want to call it. We can call it model view, this, that, or the other. But as long as your architecture separates your UI code from your logic, from your data, and many implementations of MVVM I've seen do not do that properly. As long as you're actually separating these things, you'll get the benefits of separation of concerns. And I won't ramble about that because I've talked about it enough, but believe me, you want separation of concerns. It's literally the point of architecture. It's like the point of having in my apartment, I have a bathroom and I have a kitchen and I have a bedroom, and so it's literally like saying, don't put your toilet beside your bed, or don't put a stove in the bathroom beside the shower, or don't put your bed on top of the kitchen counter. That's the same thing as having UI code talking directly to a database. It should not happen. Things should be separate. So I think that's going to be it for today. Thank you so much for watching. We will continue at this new time of 9:30 start time for the next live stream. And yeah, hopefully that was enjoyable. Hopefully there were some decent answers. I certainly got some great questions today, so thank you to everyone for that. And with that being said, I'll catch you later.